You are watching The Final Takeaway. Subscribe right away so you don't miss the moment we upload fresh videos on our channel. See the links below to all our social media platforms and send us a super thanks as a special gift if you're enjoying our content. Hey friends, let's discuss the Trump administration's hefty import duties placed on Guyana and other countries. Many countries are still reeling from getting hit with the reciprocal import duty from the US as fear of a massive trade war grows. On Trump's Liberation Day on April 2nd, 2025, Trump unveiled plans to charge countries around the world a fixed percentage rate on imports into the United States called Reciprocal Tariffs.
Brazil, 10%, 10%. Pakistan, 58%. Sri Lanka, 88%. So what we're doing is we're taking not the full, we could take the full 88%.
Guyana has not been exempted from these tariffs. It has to pay a whopping 38%, which is high when you compare the figure with what the rest of South American countries and the Caribbean are required to pay. The key question for today is, why does Guyana have to pay such high tariffs? We do have a video statement from Guyana's Vice President, Bharrat, Jagdeo, on the matter, so do stick around until the end. Also, this is a good time to clear up some confusion about who's paying 76% tariffs and who will now pay 38% tariffs. Guyana charges the United States 76% tariffs to export to Guyana. Now, the US will be charging Guyana 38% to export to the US. Depending on if the goods are coming out of the US or out of Guyana, the appropriate taxes will be applied. And now for the real stuff. We will look at economic terms such as reciprocal tariffs, trade deficits, and trade surpluses. This will help us have a wider understanding as to why some countries, such as Guyana, have been hit with higher tariffs compared to others. Keep in mind, various economic metrics or formulas were used to determine how much reciprocal tariffs each country pays. Also keep in mind that each country on the Trump tariffs list has to pay a baseline 10% duty or tax on products they send to the United States. The new U.S. tariffs levied on individual countries range from as low as 10% to as high as 50% in some cases. Of course, many of these countries did not react positively to the shocking news of having to pay these sweeping new tariffs. The new development even drew threats of economic retaliation by some governments. To begin with, let's look at what reciprocal tariffs are. Reciprocal tariffs mean charging each country on the list trading with the United States the exact amount they charge the United States to send its goods or export its goods to their country. Trump provided exceptions for some countries that are being taxed only a percentage of the tariffs they charge the United States to send goods into their country. Guyana is one of those countries. Guyana, located in South America, is among 60 U.S. trading partners that are required to pay higher tariffs. Charges will begin from April 9th, 2025 for these countries. In fact, Guyana is slapped with the highest tariffs of all the South American and Caribbean countries. Most of those countries charge the U.S. 10% tariffs. In return, the United States imposed a baseline 10% tariff on most of those countries and along with other countries worldwide. The 10% tariffs will take effect from April 5th, 2025. At first glance, charging Guyana 38% seems harsh compared to the rest of the Caribbean and South America and other countries around the world. When you consider that Guyana charges the US 76% tariffs for shipping goods to Guyana, you'll see that 38% represents half of the total 76% the Trump administration could have ordered Guyana to pay to send its products into the United States.
They charge us, we charge them less. So how can anybody be upset? They will be, because we never charged anybody anything, but now we're going to charge.
We learned that Trump's tariffs percentages were calculated on several factors, but more significantly, on the amount of bilateral trade deficits that countries created with the U.S. by buying less from the U.S. than the U.S. bought from them. Countries with the largest trade deficits have been slapped with exceptional higher tariffs. Guyana was hit with 38% because it is among the 60 countries that created large trade deficits with the United States. So what is bilateral trade deficits in the context of the United States and Guyana? A bilateral trade deficit with the U.S. happens when Guyana buys less goods or services from the U.S. than the U.S. buys from Guyana. This leads to a negative balance of trade. Here's a quick example. If Guyana imported only $500 million worth of qualifying goods from the United States, but the U.S. imported $1 billion worth of qualifying goods from Guyana, then Guyana caused a trade deficit with the United States to the amount of $500 million. So the U.S. suffered a trade imbalance or trade deficit of $500 million. A bilateral trade surplus is the opposite of a bilateral trade deficit. Turning our attention back to Guyana, how does the government feel about the 38% Trump tariffs or duty that will be placed on goods or services Guyana exports to the United States? At his weekly press conference, Guyana's Vice President, Bharrat Jagdeo, acknowledged that foreign countries with a high trade surplus with the U.S. were the ones that have to pay higher tariffs. He further noted that Guyana falls into the bracket of countries that have a bilateral trade surplus with the United States. Naturally, countries that created a huge trade deficit with the U.S. may end up with a high trade surplus. Needless to say, Guyana is being economically punished with higher tariffs due to its high trade deficit with the U.S. United States International Trade Data for 2024, published by CNN, shows that Guyana created a bilateral trade deficit in the amount of $4.06 billion. That figure is based on subtracting the total the United States spent on goods it imported from Guyana minus the total Guyana spent on goods it imported from the U.S. Based on reports, the United States says in 2024, Guyana exported $5.375 billion worth of goods or services to the U.S., while it only imported $1.32 billion worth of goods from the United States. Since the U.S. spent $5.375 billion and Guyana spent only $1.32 billion, then that explains the $4.066 billion high trade deficit it has with the U.S. and why the U.S. is demanding 38% tariffs. Guyana does not agree with the trade data the U.S. is using to calculate the tariffs and has its own numbers based off of the United Nations Comtrade database on international trade. According to UN Comtrade, Guyana's exports to the United States were $3.7 billion for 2024. Vice President Jagdeo tells us that the Comtrade data is in alignment with what Guyana reported to UN Comtrade and further disclosed that his country imported $2.56 billion worth of U.S. goods into Guyana.
We have looked at the UN Comtrade data. For 2024, it says that Guyana exported $3.3 billion into the United States of America and imported $2.56 billion. So we had a trade surplus of $799 million. That is based on our report to the UN the Comtrade database.
The vice president then acknowledged the data the U.S. reported on Guyana's trade deficit, but questioned its accuracy when compared to what UN Comtrade reported.
The United States of America reported also to Comtrade that the exports from Guyana into the United States of America was $5.5 billion. Our import was $1.3 billion, and the trade surplus is $4.1 billion. So we have differences from our reporting to Comtrade, UN Comtrade, and the US report to Comtrade.
At this point, the key question is which report is accurate. Is it the UN Comtrade or the US's? Keep in mind that the figure UN Comtrade has in its database reflects what Guyana self-reported. Based on the discrepancies seen from the Guyana side, Jagdeo reassured businesses, citizens, and stakeholders that Guyana will take up the matter with the United States in an attempt to gain a reduction in tariffs. We understand that if talks with the United States are successful, this could lead to a significant drop of tariffs for Guyana. While many are appalled at the 38% Guyana has to pay, others think that beats being asked to pay the full reciprocal 76%. As you can see, the percentage tariffs imposed represents only half of the total Guyana charges the U.S. for exporting goods into Guyana. Which leads us to our final question. Who wins and who loses in all of this? Economists estimated Trump's tariffs will haul in over $3 trillion in 10 years, regardless of the amount of reciprocal tariffs each country is expected to pay. Trump's tariffs will adversely impact all countries trading with the U.S., only that some will experience a greater impact in one way or the other, and Guyana is no exception. Trump's tariffs will also have an adverse impact on the global economy. Okay, guys, that wraps up the topic on why Trump's tariff for Guyana is so high. Stay safe. See you soon.